I'm now pleased to introduce you to our trainer today, Kenneth Carpenter, PhD. Dr. Carpenter is a clinical research scientist and clinician who has received federal and private foundation grant money for investigating the psychological, behavioral, and neurobiological factors associated with addictive behaviors and their treatment. Dr. Carpenter has over 15 years of experience developing, implementing, and evaluating evidence-based motivational and cognitive behavioral strategies for facilitating important lifestyle changes. He holds an academic appointment in Columbia University's Department of Psychiatry and is a research scientist in the Division on Substance Abuse and the Substance Treatment and Research Services, STARS, at the New York State Psychiatric Institute.
This talk today is really the last in the series around the invitation to change approach. And I'm not sure how many talks you've been able to attend over time and others you may want to catch up on. But this last set of ideas are going to focus on behavioral strategies that come from community reinforcement family training and really based on how to respond to behavior you want to strengthen and how do you respond to behavior perhaps you'd like to see less of. And we're going to talk about those strategies. But one thing I'd like to just point out is the reason why this is often the last topic that we include in the series is because all the other strategies and concepts that are presented up to this point are really the foundation to support these strategies as well. And these strategies become effective when people approach behavior with a certain set of lenses, and that was all the topics around behaviors make sense and helping with understanding and ambivalence. And when helpers themselves keep their own values and well-being on the radar. And that is being able to respond and support a loved one also requires helpers to feel nourished, connected, and taken care of as part of this process. Without the understanding, without the self-care and self-nourishment, any of the communication strategies that were spoken about last time and the behavioral strategies we'll touch on today just become a little less effective. So just a reminder, our mission, and again, as a group, you're all attending, is just as a community, can we help get evidence-based tools into the hands of families who are trying to support and be of help to loved ones who are struggling with substance use problems. In that sense, we're just as a group building communities, and we hope to just change the conversation around substance use and recovery. Particularly with an eye of trying to reduce the shame and isolation and stigma that individuals who have substance use problems often run into, and as well as their families and loved ones. Hopefully this all just leads to a culture of a little bit more hope and compassion for those who are looking to help their loved ones and for their loved ones who may be considering change. I usually start off also just inviting, I encourage anyone who's attended past lectures or discussions, if there are any questions. Last topic, I believe, was on communication strategies, how to create conversations that can be more impactful and helpful and less likely to engender defensive-ness and unhelpful communication. So I don't know if there are any reflections. I'll give a couple of seconds to see if anyone has a question or a reaction. I'm not sure what may be going through people's minds as they think about past discussions. So I can't speak to specifics, but often sometimes reactions to the communication strategies can be that they're difficult, or how does just having conversations actually make a difference, particularly if there's been a history of arguments and difficult discussions. My response usually to thinking about those ideas are this idea of trying to turn a freighter. And they're slow shifts that don't often happen fast. But the major points with communication strategies was really this importance of just shifting the tone of conversations. So even things that may seem small in the moment, like asking open questions or practicing reflective listening, or listening, and being able to step back. And if we think even way back to a couple of other discussions, the idea of the pause button, being able to just reconnect with why it's important to try to respond differently. That in and of itself can, although maybe seem like small steps, can really start to change the tone of interactions, the tone of how people are perceiving interactions, and can start to open up some possibilities of change. And someone just, thank you very much. Was appreciated the practical information that a client had. So that reinforces that even some of these ideas of just practicing these skills and thinking about behavior a little differently, we're really about trying to open up more possibilities and doors for families and loved ones. And we're not saying it's always easy, which is why we come back to self-care. We're human beings, and we're often trying to be our best selves in times where it can be difficult to feel that way. When there's fear and concern, or maybe hurt and anger. So all these skills up to this point require practice, but are about slow shifts over time that hopefully build up momentum over time for bigger change to happen. So our mantra really over all these discussions was just this idea of creating conditions for change. Not that we can cause change, or we can make change happen, or we can control the behavior of another human being, but we can create a context in which change just becomes more likely to occur. And that's what the invitation to change is about. And the way of creating conditions for change, we spoke about really just two different kinds of bins. One, helping from the inside, and we spend some time on, as a helper, how can being aware of what's important, being open to the emotions and thoughts that can show up while staying connected to what you value, and how to be a little bit more compassionate with oneself, as if one were sitting with a friend and trying to encourage them. But can we use that same set of lenses and that same voice to sit with us during these times of practicing new things? And self-compassion was really talked about in specific terms, just about how we encourage ourselves, how we speak to ourselves, and how we view ourselves being connected as human beings, and the challenges that brings. And the other part of helping was helping from the outside, which last lecture and talk was about communication strategies, which can be helping create a context of change by making interactions more collaborative, less argumentative. And today we'll talk about helping from the outside in thinking about behavioral strategies, about how it can be helpful to think strategically and upfront about how we would want to respond to behaviors that we'd like to strengthen, as well as how do we want to respond to behaviors we would not like to strengthen. Again, the common connective tissue for all of this is just opening up the room for the idea that it all takes practice, and no one's born perfect on this, but if we can stay and see it as a learning process, perhaps we can be more patient for the individuals we're hoping to support, as well as for ourselves when we're trying new things. So this is the tour that we've been doing for the last month, and we're down here in the Helping with Actions section with the red box, and that's what we'll be spending some time today talking about. So if we think about the bigger cultural messaging that's out there and that families often hear, When it comes to ideas about how do I respond to my loved one's behavior, how should I react? How should I respond? And some of the messaging can be very much over to extreme on one side, which is really there's nothing you can do to respond to a loved one's substance use. So really the best option you have is to just step away. And by stepping away, you'll create room for an individual to experience all the negative consequences of their use, and let your loved one hit rock bottom, might be one of the phrases that families run into. The other side of that is if you're going to do anything to be helpful or positive in this circumstance, you run the risk of making things worse. And often there's labeling that's associated with that, in which people and families are labeled as enablers or being codependent. Which basically gives the overarching message to families is step away, let your loved one hit rock bottom, there's nothing you can do. And if you try to be supportive in any way, it's actually a big mistake and you're gonna make it worse, or there's a flaw in you for doing that. So that can be some of the messaging that people have coming into an office to talk about change if you're a clinician. And for families, this may be the messages you've already heard in your own family journey. But what we'd like to do, and we offer a new set of lenses for this, is try to repurpose and rethink about those terms and rethink about, as we said, this nexus of science and kindness, where how can relationships and connections among family members actually be used in a way that helps create a context for change. Those earlier messaging basically says they can't be, so therefore you need to kind of put that in the closet until change happens, and then you can bring it back out. So in venturing together on this idea, I'd like to just share a story about gardening. And I always use this caveat to people as I'm not the best gardener at all. But I'd like you to imagine that you were sitting with me one day, and I've got this task of growing a garden. And I get really concerned because flowers can be fragile. They can grow, but they can die. Other things can get in the garden that can be scary, like weeds, and threaten the integrity and health of a garden. And all that responsibility to grow and manage a healthy, prospering garden can be a lot for someone to bear. So when I was given that job, I figured, why not get some help from my neighbors? So I went next door to my neighbor, and he lived on the right-hand side of the house. And I said, you know what? I've got to be gardening, and I'm starting this process, and I'm noticing I'm starting to get some weeds in that garden. And I don't know how I should respond to that. So he looks at the garden, he comes back and says, well, you know what you really got to do here, Ken? You got to cut off all the water. Shut it off. The worst thing you can do is water that garden. Because if you do that, you're going to water the weeds and they're going to grow like crazy. So that's the last thing you want to do is enable the weeds. So cut off that water. After the weeds all go away, you can get back to the act of gardening and supporting those flowers. So I thought about that for a while. Seemed like some of it made some sense. But it didn't really sit right with me. And I was looking at his garden and I started getting a little concerned by the way he was managing it. But if anyone wants to chat or if anyone wants to comment, what could be a downside to cutting off the water when I'm trying to manage my garden? So right, and now as I'm thinking that, yeah, that makes total sense. That's probably why his garden doesn't look too healthy right now. And if I cut off all the water, what about the flowers I actually want to support? They're not going to be able to thrive. So at best, what I get is just a patch of dirt at the end of the day. I might not have the weeds, but I'm also missing the flowers I want. So I walk away from that neighbor saying, you know what, I'm probably not going to take that advice. And I go to my other neighbor, and they're a couple, and they come out and they say, and I pose the same problem to them, got my garden, concerned about the weeds. And their response was, you know what, you got to water it all the time. And just shower that garden with water. And you know what, if you water it, keep your fingers crossed, but at least your flowers will be growing, and hopefully they'll outgrow and get stronger to outlast the weeds. I thought about that for a while. That seemed to make some sense, because the other strategy, is we've all indicated, is my flowers aren't going to grow, so it must be important to continue watering. But there was something a little scary about that approach too. Just watering everything. And for those that are in the chat box, could anyone see the downside, just showering that garden with just water? Okay, right, we could get some overwatering in plants and areas. Absolutely, too much water could be problematic, and at the same time, overwatering and not spreading where it's actually needed, absolutely, they could drown if it's too much. So the flowers could get, if I'm just indiscriminate in my watering and just constantly do it, could overwhelm the flowers. And at the same time, weeds I know are pretty good, and they're survivors. And if they're getting watered, they'll figure out a way to grow and perhaps grow more rapidly in the short run. And that will also threaten my garden. So thank you all for that input. I feel a little bit more confident, so that means there's got to be a different answer then. I can't just water everything, and I shouldn't just cut off all the water. There must be a more nuanced approach to being able to grow and maintain variety and a healthy garden. And as you're all highlighting, perhaps the nuanced approach is, as a comment was saying, too much of anything can be a problem. So perhaps the nuanced approach is really, how can I be judicious and strategic in watering and supporting the flowers I want? And just being thoughtful about how and when I water, and just be careful about not inadvertently watering the weeds. That middle road strategy gives me a little bit of a blueprint. It still lets me garden and tend to the flowers I want to grow, and just helps me be thoughtful about how I want to respond to the weeds. And as someone just pointed out, selecting the areas that you want to work on. And that's a beautiful approach, that in order to have a beautiful, varied, healthy garden, we need to select the flowers that we want to help nourish and grow, and be selective about the areas that we don't necessarily want to inadvertently support. So I'm really excited that I have such wonderful gardeners here in our presence today that are giving me such great kind of a compass for this. And what I invite us all to think about is, one way to think about supporting individuals who are looking to make change is if we view their behavioral repertoire as a varied, beautiful behavioral garden that requires nourishment and watering for the behaviors to continue those that we want to help support and grow, and to be thoughtful about the behaviors that we don't. And we're going to use that bridge to think about these ideas in terms of reinforcement and responding to behavior. So today we'll talk about the use of positive reinforcement. That's our water, to grow, strengthen, and support the behaviors and areas of an individual's behavioral garden that we want to help grow. And for those areas of a behavioral garden that we don't want to necessarily support or grow, we're just going to touch on these ideas of natural consequences, setting limits, and strategically stepping away. It's the combination of both of these that encompass a powerful behavioral blueprint for how loved ones can think about responding to the behaviors that they see in the individuals they want to care and support and stay connected to. So the first thing we're going to think about is just the idea of watering. Let's build on this idea of positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement in the world of craft and behavioral support is the water for behavioral growth and development. And if we think about way back in the first time we started talking together, this idea of behaviors makes sense. And that was a set of lenses to think about why individuals would want to stay attached to substance use. And the invitation was because there's probably something about that behavior that's reinforcing. So we use that idea to think about understanding substance use behavior. And now we're going to extend it to a broader view of just an individual's behavioral garden. The utility of positive reinforcement and the strength of this, it really, when we think about a world that is meaningful to journey in, a world that's meaningful to all of this, it's often a world that offers positive reinforcement for behaviors that could be meaningful to us. So if we're able to water a garden and the world offers positive reinforcement, it just strengthens behaviors and makes them more likely to happen. That includes new behaviors, which are often part of the change process. And it's strategic watering. It's not just being nice. And if we want to continue with this metaphor, it's just not talking nice to flowers. That can be a nice way to garden, but flowers also need very specific responses and watering. So it is a strategic response and way to interact with the flowers we're trying to nurture. And importantly, flowers that are getting stronger, behaviors that are getting stronger, particularly those behaviors that can compete or take the place of substance use, which are also called positive opposites, are really the key ingredients of the recovery and change process. And what behavioral science tells us can be boiled down to this particular graph, that when a behavior happens and a response occurs that reinforces it, it just makes that behavior more likely to happen again in the future. And there's a lot of different ways we can think about this. We talk about it in terms of behaviors. And for those of you who might be more biologically inclined or want to think on that level, and hear about words of dopamine, every time reinforcement happens, the brain remembers that. Our brain gets altered, which makes those pathways a little bit more stronger and more likely to get activated in similar circumstances. So this idea of growing positive behaviors and reinforcement can be looked at all different levels. Right here in this slide, we're just talking about it in terms of the behaviors we see. And why would this be helpful to families? Why, when we think about this idea of watering a garden and helping families think about the utility of positive reinforcement? Because one, and I think importantly, and this is a key message from Kraft, is it actually gives family members permission to continue to respond to the behaviors they want to support. They're allowed to still stay connected to their loved one. Supporting the behaviors you want to grow, watering the flowers you want to support, in our set of lenses here is not enabling in the way that term is often used. And if it's okay, I'd like to repurpose that term, which is it's enabling flowers to grow. And that's what gardeners would like to do. By watering flowers, we're enabling them to grow. So it's just a strategic use of the water that's key. And for families, they can stay connected to loved ones or respond to those behaviors that they'd like to. They're not enablers or codependent for wanting to do that. It allows helping strategies and helps people think through how strategically they would like to respond to behaviors. And again, it's an antidote to the sometimes narrative that we spoke about detachment and the over-reliance on punishment to help promote change, which we'll pick up on a little bit. And if we give permission to families to stay connected to their loved one and to respond to their loved one in ways that are consistent with their values, that's a much different, more empowering message for family members than the terms that they often run into, which can fuel shame, isolation, and withdrawal. And then we know when we discussed way back in the beginning, family involvement predicts better outcomes. It's how the family members interact. So positive reinforcement is a key strategy here. Now, it's easy to talk about reinforcement. Takes practice noticing behaviors sometimes you want to support, particularly when it's in a context that's been contentious and while there's other behaviors that you don't want to support. And it takes some thought. So here are just some tips that we kind of work with families when we think about that. And the first tip or question to invite family members to think about is to be clear for themselves. What's the behaviors they're trying to increase? Can they see them? Can they define them? Is it talking in a nicer tone? Is it being home on time? Is it making a self-help meeting or attending treat? Could be any behavior. Could be taking your dish off the dinner table. The key for watering is we have to know the flowers we're looking for. It's hard to water flowers we can't identify ourselves. So what's the behavior am I trying to increase and grow? And can we be as specific as we can about that? For example, just some, I can say, yeah, I want to reinforce them to be more responsible. Well, that's a tough one because what is that really? What does that look like in action? Is that being home on time? Is that talking nicely? Is that doing something else? So we want to help guide people to think more specific in terms of what they're looking for. And then the next question is, how do I want to reward or reinforce the behavior? What is the water that I want to use in response to seeing that behavior? Is it something tangible? Is it a smile? Is it a statement of appreciation? Is it an affirmation that you spoke about in the communication section last time? But to think through that with families, what are the reinforcers they would like to use? Critical, and this is important, that reinforcers only work when they're provided after the behavior, not before. So it's much different to thank someone or to reward someone after you see the behavior than to say, I'd like you to see the behavior, and then give the reinforcer beforehand. And I can just use one example, but much different to say, if you get an A on your test, you'll earn the car for this Saturday, versus here's the car and I would like you to get an A on the test. How the car works here is going to be much different. It's much more effective as a reinforcer if it's given after the behavior occurs. Other important components of reinforcers is that they should be given consistently. So it's important. If I say I'm going to water the flower, if I'm going to say if you engage in this behavior, if you come home on time, I will give you a hug, then I should give that hug if they're home on time. And I should do that as close to the behavior as possible in a timely way. And again, the reinforcer should match the behavior. An exaggerated response would be, I'll buy you a house if you come home on time. There's a big mismatch between what the behavior is and what we're offering as a reinforcer. But I ask you to think of this. Remember from our first lecture and discussion is drugs are powerful reinforcers. And that's the way we were talking about it with behaviors makes sense. One of the reasons why drugs and substances are powerful reinforcers for substance use behavior is they are very consistent, they're extremely timely, and they work quite fast. and usually match the behavior. So when we think about our use of reinforcement to water other flowers, matching that would be important. Giving a reward several weeks after the behavior happens makes it less effective. And just two other components when we're working with families and when we're thinking about the use of this in our own lives or the lives of families we're working with is reinforcers should be in the eyes of the beholder. That is, when families are thinking about the reinforcer, they can use their expertise in what they know their loved one likes, so that when they do offer reinforcers, it's something that's desirable to their loved one. And importantly, and we keep this for last, the reinforcer has to be doable for the family member. It has to be something they're comfortable offering, including if someone's got a very restricted budget and they promise a loved one a lot of money for doing something, that probably would not be doable for a family member. Or if a person needs a car to get to work and they offer using the car to their loved one, that might not be doable because they need that car for work. So the conversations we're having with family members all include these important items to think through when reinforcing a behavior that we want to increase in strength. Any questions on this? Now we can be creative for reinforcers. And I put this slide up just to think out loud. And if anybody wants to comment, without even knowing the behavior we want to water. As human beings, often there are things that we feel many people can respond to if they're offered. So reinforcers can come in all shapes and sizes, can be different for different people, and can vary in terms of cost, how they're delivered. There's a lot of creativity and flexibility in this. And for just basic groups, reinforcers can be free. And if someone wanted to take a stab thinking about a response to a behavior to water it, make it stronger, what could be a response to a behavior that doesn't cost financially anything to someone, but that if they were being thoughtful about wanting to reinforce a behavior, they could use? Any thoughts? And reinforcers, there's a comment, reinforcers have to make sense to the person who the behavior needs to be changed, right? I can't turn, absolutely, that's such an important point. And I'll put that down here, and you hit right on that aspect, that reinforcers are in the eyes of the beholder. If we're offering something that doesn't make sense to the person whose behavior is trying to be supported, then you're absolutely right. That's not going to serve as a reinforcer because it's not going to have any effect on the behavior. So there's freedom and flexibility in thought for this, but to that point, if we're going to use it, let's try to think through the eyes of the person who's going to receive it. And would they see this as being something that's desirable and useful that they want? And while we can't determine that, that's true, we can use, and particularly with families, we can use their understanding of their loved one, knowing what their loved one likes, to think about what could be reinforcing. Reinforcers that have been free can be smiles, nods, pats on the back, hugs, spending time with someone, praise. Yes, exactly, right? So that praise would be a nice reinforcer that it's free, and it's also a word. It's a verbal statement. Words of encouragement, exactly, right? That in and of itself can actually increase the likelihood of behavior happens. And it is interesting if we think about the world we live in. Why is praise and encouragement so powerful? And some of it's because if we think about it, how infrequent it can be in many of our lives, where there's not acknowledgement for behaviors that are done, or praise, or a smile, or a statement of appreciation, and just thinking about how that can go a long way. So beautiful examples, everyone, on free reinforcers, and reinforcers that are words. Again, interestingly, this changes the tone. Perhaps in a family, there's no communication, that has gone out the window, and loved ones are concerned, so they're more likely to see what's not going well. So these invitations are also an invitation to think for family members to view the whole garden and to see what flowers they would also like to water, because perhaps maybe they've lost sight of that. For good reason, weeds can be pretty scary. But to step back and think about the whole garden can be important. And praise and encouragement can be huge. How about reinforcers that cost something? Any ideas? Okay, gifts, right? Could be a gift. Could be small gifts, could be something that, gift cards, it could be a little token. It can vary in all shapes and sizes and costs, but yes, that's something that's tangible, that would cost something, that can be given as a reinforcement. And they can be combined with activities, right? Activities, going to the movies, or movie tickets. It could even be gas for a car, or paying for a video game, or allowing for Xbox, or an ice cream treat, yes. Day out, a mani-pedi, yes. Great examples. A pizza night, absolutely. A lot of flexibility in thinking about what could potentially be put down on a list. And if you're working with families, if that's your call, if that's what you're doing in your professional life, these conversations, even with this chart, could just be something to think out loud about. And then just work together to refine it, as was previously stated, to fine tune it to what family members think their loved one would like. And reinforces that our activities all tie into that as well. Pizza, ice cream, going out together, a pizza night, spending time together, being in each other's presence, or having space, which is the opposite side of that, depending on the age. So we can be quite thoughtful about this in tailoring this. And I like to take a springboard here, because as we take all our creative thoughts here about all the different reinforcers that are out there, I'm going to show a video, and I'm going to ask you to watch this video. And the video in itself was, there was a challenge. They wanted to increase stair taking for people. And they had to figure out how to do that. So they wanted to use reinforcement as the first strategy to try to help increase people taking stairs. So my questions to everybody as you watch this: one, from just a pure reinforcement strategy, a watering the flowers strategy, can you see or label what the reinforcement was for this behavior? What's the reinforcer they used? And also think about how this is different than what we would consider punishment strategies. So you'll notice people have a choice to make between taking an escalator and taking stairs. The reinforcement strategy is, let's reinforce stair taking. Punishment strategy would be, how do we punish escalator taking? And it's just a different set of lenses. This video will show what happens when you just focus on reinforcing the behavior you'd like to see more of. And then we'll talk about the escalator later. See if you can find the reinforcer. Here we go. So did anyone see what the reinforcer, what was the reinforcer in this? Anyone want to take a stab at that? Okay, fun, new experience, creativity. Absolutely. So we're moving in that direction. They're making that experience of stair taking different. And the difference there is when people stepped on the stairs, they heard a sound, they heard music. Absolutely. So notice the combination there. If I take a step, I hear a note, the music was the reinforcer. And by adding the reinforcer to the stair taking, it makes it more pleasurable, enjoyed, and changes the experience of taking the stairs. Just that in and itself increased stair taking by 66%. I can put on my research cap and I'll just speak from you this way. If we change 66% of the behavior in a research study, there was a 66% change. That would be considered a significant result. So this example just signifies that the idea of positive reinforcement can be quite useful in all different ways. And if we want to take that step a little bit more to thinking about behavioral gardens, that by focusing and introducing reinforcement when people are having to make decisions, it can help the choices people make. And that's what we saw in the video. Doesn't mean 100% of the people took the stairs. There were still people taking the escalator. But just by adding reinforcement into the world and into the decisions, a notable shift occurs. So we're going to dig a little deeper on that and come back to just thinking about positive reinforcement here. And I don't know if you have access to your PDF sheets, you'll see some of these exercises. If not, just you can have a piece of paper and pen and jot down your ideas there. And if you have time to go back to these handouts, you can use them for your own study and or for people that you're working with. But we're going to look for some reinforcers here. Someone comes to us and says, I've got this dilemma, and here's my dilemma. My son has lost his job, and his grades are getting worse. And he seems to be on something. He always seems tired, particularly when he's at home. And lately, he doesn't even want to be in the same room as us. We've tried to talk, but he rarely talks about what's going on. And when we ask questions now, it often turns into an argument. And I really wish things were just different like they were 3 or 4 years ago. Matter of fact, the only time he seems to be in a good mood is when he's playing his guitar and writing music. So how can I get through to him? Because I really think he's heading in the wrong direction. So there's a lot going on for this individual. And I guess the first question, if we just think as a group and we wanted to help this person think about, well, what could potentially be reinforcers that could be used if we were going to use this as a strategy to help strengthen behaviors that he would like his son to engage in more. So without even defining the behavior we want to influence, just knowing how he described his son, what could be some potential reinforcers that he could think about using? Okay, music, right. And what, if we dug a little deeper on that, what specifically about the music? Okay, great, that's another one. So we know he likes music and he likes playing his guitar. And family playing music together. So that could be a reinforcer, right? The family, if they're musicians or they all get together to come together to do that. Making music about how they feel as a family activity. So absolutely, family activity could be one way to go. Okay. Any more creative ways? Purchasing new music items if his grades improve? Okay, great. Absolutely, right? We could think about, well, he likes to write music and play his guitar. Or if we went into the box of activities, family making music together could be important. If we go into reinforcers that cost something, perhaps purchasing some new music items for him could be helpful. Or, as someone mentioned, concerts, helping him think about, helping reinforce and use his interest in music. So tickets for a concert. Absolutely. Wonderful examples, everyone. Thank you. And okay, so now we're doing a deeper dive. This is great. The argument is a negative reinforcer. It encourages the son not to have conversation with the parents. If when they talk, it will push him away. Exactly. And if I can pick up on that, that's a beautiful example of him leaving the room to get away from the argument is the reinforcement for getting up and leave. So let me just put this out there, since this is a bonus round around this question, which is, if we noticed that when he sat down, it started into an argument because there were questions about what's going on with him, you're not talking to us, and the family wanted to increase him just spending time with them. How could they change their strategy here? Anyone have an idea? We see that every time a question about how he's doing when he's not talking starts an argument, and then he wants to leave to get away from the argument. Perhaps one strategy could be thinking about the communication strategies that we spoke about last time. Is what would it be like to ask a different kind of open question or an affirmation? Or perhaps not engaging in a conversation right away, but using listening in silence as just a way of reinforcing that. It could be an open question. What does he think can be done to improve the relationship? Absolutely. That's a nice open question. So the communication strategies and different ways of positively reinforcing him to just stay in the room can be another useful way to think about reinforcement. And in this case, helping families think through what just happens before he leaves might help them think about altering their approach and strategy if they'd like him to continue to just spend time with them. So I appreciate all of your brain power around this. It's a beautiful example about how reinforcement can be thought through with families. What I like to build on here, and this is really a cool thing about being human, is we can have conversations, as you all highlighted in the previous slide. So we can be verbal. We can use conversations to invite in behavior. And that's actually a great thing to have, because if we didn't have that, we would actually have to sit around and wait for a behavior to happen before we watered it. That may happen fast, but perhaps it doesn't, or perhaps the behavior happens when we don't see it, and then it's harder to even water it because we can't see it. So we want to build on communication strategies because we can talk and in conversations use our way of conversating to invite in behaviors, to make them more likely to happen. But how that's delivered and how those kind of conversations are framed are really important because, again, sometimes communication can be broken down. It could be with a history of arguments. So being able to invite in behavior can be tricky. And the skills we'll be talking about here is how can a request or an invitation be structured that may make it more likely to be heard. And some of the ideas around that is we want to do it verbally to increase motivation. Gives a blueprint to an individual about, well, what behaviors would we like to see? And how can we make that clear for a person so they have a good understanding of kind of what we're looking for? And if we're able to put it out there beforehand, it can often be done in a less charged way, and be influential for people when they're making decisions. And again, it doesn't control behavior. Even going back to our escalator example and stairs, not 100% of the people took the stairs, but it significantly shifted the amount of times people did. So it creates a context in which other behaviors may become a little bit more likely. And I just want to highlight all the traveling that you've done with these other lectures. I mean, we've covered a lot, and just that these communication strategies can also be rolled in to think about inviting in behaviors. And I just wanted to highlight some of the ones that are implicit in the background here. That the use of the OR skills, the love skills, can be helpful in delivering these. That it's important to keep in mind the signals and the lights, timing of these conversations. It's also other indicators that a loved one is more likely to be listening. If I know that my loved one doesn't like talking before they've had their first cup of coffee, I might not want to send this invitation until they've had their first cup of coffee. So being sensitive to timing and the signs and signals are really key. And we want to practice being specific. And I think this is really the challenge to all of these, even with reinforcement in these invitations. The more specific we can define the behavior, the more helpful this will be to the person that we're sending the invitation to. And we're building on the idea that what's reinforcing for people is different, and that change doesn't happen all at once. And for the helper, when they're going to have these conversations, that they're monitoring their own awareness, their own emotions, and being connected to their boundaries and values as they do this. So we're going to review or be introduced to this idea of surfing, or surf for inviting behaviors. And often this strategy in working with families can be helpful in them thinking about, if I'm going to create an invitation, how should I word it? And here are the 4 kind of dimensions we ask people to think about. That whatever behavior you want to invite, let's make it as specific to that behavior as possible. It avoids conversational traps that can happen if we're overly general, because things can be misunderstood, or people could react to things that we say that we didn't intend or want them to react to. So the more specific a family can be, the better. To the extent that an understanding statement can be offered, to the extent that as we send an invitation to a loved one, we can try to see the world from their eyes a little bit and include that in the statement, the more likely it is to be perceived as a collaborative process. Often these ideas come in a context in which everyone has a little responsibility in how things have gone and how things can move forward. So we ask family members to think about, if it makes sense, is there anything in here that they can take partial responsibility for? Not to make it up, it's never taking full ownership, but we'll see an example when we go through together. But always this idea about what can you take partial responsibility for? It helps model that for a loved one. Often others are more likely to take responsibility for their part in it if they see other people doing that. And it keeps it collaborative. And the importance here of using feeling statements, words for our feelings as opposed to behaviors and tones. Labeling anger as a word, I'm feeling angry right now, can be heard and result in different reactions than if I slam doors and yell. So we want to allow room for feelings, but we want to help encourage family members to use their words to describe that. So if we're surfing and using these ingredients to make a request, what does that look like in action? And I know in your handouts, you'll have a worksheet for this. And by the way, some of those worksheets, if you're in the counseling end, if that's your cap that you wear, can be used even to hand to family members to think through this. So as we move to surfing, it's going to be the same idea that we thought about with reinforcement. Timing of conversations is key. Tone of conversations is really important. A beautiful thing about having counseling and having partners here is conversations often can be helpful if they're practiced beforehand. So there's nothing wrong, and in my counseling sessions, I might work with family members to practice how they're going to talk, how they want to invite a behavior, how they would like to make a specific request. Let's write it out. Let's role play. Let's role play when it goes well. Let's talk about some of the things that can get in the way of a soft landing with this. And let's brainstorm how you can respond to that all beforehand. And importantly, for family members, they can practice these conversation skills on smaller requests, not that they have to jump into the conversation that they've been hoping to have for months as the first go at it. And the smaller steps and smaller conversations can be another great way to practice without the emotional charge that comes along with it. So let's look at John. And he's the father of a 22-year-old daughter, and her name is Jennifer. And she's recently come back from graduating college and has been trying to find a job. But John's been worried about her because he's saying she hasn't been acting like herself. In fact, she's staying out with her friends fairly frequently during the week. Seems like she's drinking more, and she's been sleeping later into the afternoons. And she really has not been showing any interest in finding work. He's been putting in a lot of overtime at work, and he really hasn't been home as much as he would really like. But he wants to talk to her about looking for work. His request is that he would like her to start seeking employment. But in the past, every time he brings this up, they wind up yelling and getting into fights. So we've all just thought about surf skills and how to invite behavior. So John wants to invite a behavior for Jennifer, which specifically is completing job applications. And notice how we're wording this for John. And that's the first part of SURF, which is, can you be specific? John, what would you actually like to see more of? First, he said, I'd like her to be more responsible. Well, that's kind of general. That's hard. It's hard to water that. And if he starts a conversation with Jennifer saying he would like her to be more responsible, she can interpret that in a lot of different ways. She can say she already is. She gets home on time. That's responsible. She's been keeping things around the house fairly in order. That's responsible. So notice how the conversation can all of a sudden get into how we define responsible. So as John practiced, he was able to really get specific and said, well, ultimately what I'd like to see start to grow and become more frequent is just Jennifer completing job applications. Now, there's three other parts of the SURF. There's an understanding statement, partial responsibility, and feeling statements that John can use in crafting his request or invitation to complete job applications. I'm just going to leave it open for about 30 seconds or so. Please feel free to shout out or type out any of the URF parts of SURF that you could help John with. If John wanted to offer an understanding statement, what could that be? If he wanted to take partial responsibility in this scenario and model that, what could that be? Or if he wanted to use words to label his feelings, what could that be? So if anyone wants to take a stab at any of those, I'll leave a little space for that, and then we'll move to the next slide. Okay, and that's good advice to John to practice his listening skills. Open-minded to others' needs, right? So he's going to open up to what possibly Jennifer wants, if this is what you mean by that. And be careful about the tone, that it's not judgmental. So that's a great Great start on that. And John's struggling with that, but he comes back and says, but what word should I use? How can I say that? So if we wanted to help give him a script, what could be the words he uses for an understanding statement or a feeling statement or a partial responsibility statement? Okay, I'm going to change the slide. Empathetic. I know that things have been difficult for you. Awesome. So there's an empathetic. That can be an understanding statement. I know that things have been difficult for you since you came back from college. Beautiful. And if he's including that, it may set a different tone to the conversation. And notice, open up the door where Jennifer may be less defensive and can hear what this invitation will be. Thank you very much for that. Okay, a beautiful open question. Is there anything that I can do to help you? And that can be a collaborative approach to put into that saying, and thinking about the information sandwich even that you covered last time, which would be a nice way to check in. So thank you for that. That can be also a nice thing John can include. Oh, that's awesome too. Wow, so we've got a lot of surfing going on here. Partial responsibility. I know I haven't been home much to assist you with the applications. A perfect part of this that John could actually model and take partial responsibility for. And notice what we're going to do is try to integrate and weave these statements together so that John can make an invitation to asking Jennifer to increase her job applications. But by including these, it just sets a different tone to the delivery and helps John communicate in a way that Jennifer may be more likely to listen to this invitation. So taking all of your ideas into mind, this is something that John scripted in your office and worked hard on. And it's, Jennifer, I know that it hasn't been easy for you since you came back from school. I also know that I've been working a lot, so it may not seem like I'm available to help. I'm concerned that you have a lot of downtime and will need to spend money. And I would like you to start looking for work. In fact, if you complete applications during the week, I'm willing to give you the car on the days you apply to use for the whole day. What are your thoughts? Or that could also be a question, is there anything else that I could do to help you? Can anyone identify the reinforcer that John is putting out there to reinforce completing applications? What's the water he's putting out on the table for Jennifer? Yes, give me the car. Absolutely. Now, he's thought that that would be helpful to her and that might be something that's meaningful to her in a way that is reinforcing. So if she looks for application, she can borrow the car for that. Now, of course, when we think about all the important ingredients, when she's going to fill out job applications, he would have to follow through. That would be important, that she actually gets the car, that she gets the car on the day she's going to do this and completes the application. And that seems like it's not an overly exaggerated reinforcer for what he's asking for her. And it's reinforcing to her. She wants to use the car. So wonderful job, everyone. And you can notice where we've weaved this in is that we use the surf ingredients to help someone structure an invitation for a specific behavior they'd like to see more of and include what the reinforcement is going to be if the behavior occurs. Doesn't guarantee that Jennifer's going to look for a job or complete a job application, but it increases and creates a context that maybe she'll be more likely to do that. In other words, she may hear the sound on the stairs that can grab her attention. So we covered just this idea of reinforcement, the idea of including reinforcement and using surf skills to help families script a conversation or an invitation for a behavior. And reinforcement doesn't have to be verbally an invitation, although it can be for people that would like to communicate some expectations or things they would like to see more of. And the other part of this is when they do see behaviors they'd like to support, to think about responding to it in a way that allows them to stay connected and keep those flowers growing. But when we use reinforcement in this, there's a lot of sticking points because the greater culture and narratives often confuse reinforcement with other things. And just some of the ideas I would put out there is often it can be confused with enabling. And in this context, what we think of as enabling is enabling is tricky in the sense that ultimately we want to be able to give power to people and enable them to step into the life they want. So we want to reinforce and strengthen behaviors that we'd like to see more of and strengthen. What we want to be careful of, and this is where this term often is we want to be careful about not watering the weeds or reinforcing behaviors we don't want to support. Often reinforcement gets talked about in terms like bribing. Why should we bribe people to do this behavior anyway? Shouldn't they want to do that on their own? And this can get tricky, and this is conversations that would be important to have. Remember, we're coming from the set of lenses that all flowers need reinforcement, all flowers need to be watered. Just a fundamental idea about human behavior. So I would reword that as, why should I have to reinforce someone for doing something? Shouldn't they do it anyway? Well, if we took out all the reinforcement in the world, and even in our lives, would we keep doing the things that we do? Some of it might be difficult. People stop supporting us or complimenting us or giving us encouragement, or if other reinforcers in your life were removed. So I reword that, and we think about not as bribery, but as reinforcement, because from this set of lenses, reinforcement is just the scaffolding that helps flowers grow. The importance about reinforcement is that it occurs after the behavior and not before. And sometimes that's one way I think about bribery. Sometimes bribery is trying to get someone to do something they don't want to do by having them receive the reinforcer before it happens, or that the reinforcer is so disproportionate to the behavior that it seems like it's a misfit, and that can be a signal too. This idea of forgetting about the bad behavior, notice, let's go back to our garden metaphor. There's nothing in the use of reinforcement that says you have to ignore bad behavior. It just invites people to think about the behavior they want to grow. And that's just as important. As you all highlighted, if I cut off all the water to the garden, at best I'm going to have a patch of dirt. And that's ultimately not what we're trying to help people have in their lives. And yes, reinforcement can be really hard to deliver, particularly when there's a long history of painful hurt, emotions, and conflict. So the idea of self-awareness and compassion and self-care is critical to this. Reinforcement's important. It also is a challenge to deliver it when it doesn't feel good to deliver. And that can be a challenge. But we do highlight and want to work with family members about coming back to what they value and why is it important to reinforce behaviors for their loved ones. Is this something that is consistent with the kind of person they want to be with their loved one? Is this in line with if they want to stay connected to their loved one? So we can have those conversations and validate the fact that sometimes it can be a hard thing to do in the moment. And reinforcing behaviors you want to strengthen is not just ignoring dangerous behaviors as well. And that's kind of where we're going to move now when we think about the behaviors you don't want to support. Any questions up to this point? So we spent a lot of time thinking about growing flowers and strengthening them. what are some of the strategies families have for responding to the behaviors that they don't want to reinforce? And from the CRAFT model, from the ITC, the set of lenses we think about reducing behaviors are these three strategies. How do natural consequences play into the idea of reducing behaviors? How do you set limits? And the idea of stepping away from behaviors. The important thing I want to come back around to, as you've all helped me in that gardening metaphor, is it can be the combination of both that is critically important here. Often the culture, and when we think about behaviors we don't necessarily want to support, our mind can pull us to all the behavior reducing strategies. And the idea of the behavior strengthening strategies get left out on the curb. We want to include both, that if we're using behavior reducing strategies, we still need to grow the flowers and strengthen the flowers that we want. Another critically important thing here that I'd like to highlight, and this comes from all the behavioral science literature, is behavior reducing strategies never erase behaviors. So there is nothing in the world that erases a behavior that we've already learned. Things can make it less useful, things can make it less likely to occur, but at best, reducing strategies reduce the frequency of a behavior, which opens up room for new behaviors to start to grow. Sometimes people get the message that if you just limit the behavior enough and apply enough pressure on it, the behaviors will stop and they'll disappear. And I just want to put that out, is that there's no science to support that. It's great for the 99.9% of the behaviors we want to keep doing, and it's a little wrench in the system when we think about the behaviors we want to stop. At best, they only can be reduced. So we want to help families think about the combination of these strategies when thinking about the long-term journey of change. And it really comes down to our favorite pictures that we like to show here, in that if there's a behavior that we don't want to reinforce, how you respond to that has different effects. The natural consequences, setting limits and stepping away, are strategies to just make the behavior less likely to occur, or in a sense get smaller in the garden. However, there are other strategies that can actually inflame the situation to make in the moment behaviors actually seem worse off. And we want to stay away from those strategies, which we'll talk about. So in the idea of CRAFT, we're going to talk about natural consequences, which is allowing the world to respond naturally to the behaviors people engage in a way that makes them less likely to occur again. And for families, the idea in conversations will be, what are you allowed or willing to allow to happen? And being careful to not block them, because blocking them can take away the effect of natural consequences. To some extent, this is where hitting rock bottom comes from, which is that the idea that if people experience enough negative consequences in their life related to the behavior, they'll be motivated to stop. The issue is, often people, without positive reinforcement for other behaviors, rock bottom can be a long way for people. When people have choices and are reinforced for other behaviors while experiencing natural consequences, the bottom doesn't have to be so low. So often CRAFT will talk about the idea of raising the bottom for people. But notice, hitting rock bottom often implies too that you can't use reinforcement, you have to step away. And what we're saying is natural consequences can be happening along with reinforcing the behaviors you want, and that's an important message for families. Limit setting is using the surf skills to let people know what will happen if a behavior occurs that goes against their limits or crosses their limits. And stepping away is going to be a strategy for families for a way of just removing themselves from the situation. In a sense, taking away any social reinforcement or reaction that could make a behavior worse. What we're not recommending with behavior reducing strategies is this idea of inflicting pain or negative emotional states on people. I mean, we can think of extreme examples of hitting and causing that, but name calling, demeaning, ridiculing, any of those things that kind of add fuel to an emotional reaction are not recommended, because often what that strategy does is it just motivates people to avoid. Not avoid the situation, but avoid the person who's inflicting that on them, which undermines even the idea of connectedness in collaborative relations. And enabling, if we think about it through these lenses, is often just protecting or blocking natural consequences that happen inadvertently. So let's just visit natural consequences for the moment. And natural consequences, again, are helping family members think through what they're willing to have their loved one experience as a result of their substance use. Notice natural consequences are just the direct outcomes of substance use that an individual experiences if there were no special circumstances that got in the way. And they both can be internal experiences and external costs. And often they do have people start to considering change. When people come into contact or experience negative outcomes of a behavior, it can also give food for thought and a pause to reflect on this cost-benefit analysis. Importantly for family members, if natural consequences are allowed to occur, the family members aren't the ones delivering the consequences. It's the outgrowth of the behavior itself. So it kind of takes loved ones out of the equation of having to be the ones delivering these consequences, which can impact relationships, and actually allows loved ones to be more in a position to validate, certainly acknowledge that it's difficult for their loved one to experience that, and to reinforce other behaviors. Takes away some of the fighting and conflictual interactions that happen. An important part here, though, is that natural consequences are not always seen by loved ones. They might not necessarily see their loved one experiencing negative effects of their use, so they assume there are none going on. But they can take many forms. They can be quiet, they could be hangovers or headaches or physical uncomfortability that loved ones are experiencing. Negative emotional states that show up could be anxiety, psychological states that are uncomfortable, could be internal medical complications that arise. Notice these physical, biological, natural consequences aren't always seen or experienced by loved ones, or by family members, but loved ones could actually be experiencing these during the day. Social negative consequences certainly could be employment, loss of employment, missing activities that used to be important to individuals, the relationships not going well and falling apart, and certainly legal consequences in the world can also be consequences. These aren't everything that has to happen. They're just an example that natural consequences come in all these different domains and are often going on behind the scenes while an individual's struggling. I'm just going to do an exercise with people. If we wanted to think about this individual and tried to help them identify natural consequences that they can think about, what could be some natural consequences? My daughter's behavior is getting more erratic. Her grades are slipping, and I've been staying up late trying to stay on top of her so she completes all her assignments, and we're often arguing. This weekend, we argued first thing in the morning. She got home late and overslept. I had to wake her up and drive her to the team practice just so she wouldn't get tossed off the team. 2 weeks ago, I had to wake her up on the porch because she passed out and she was chilly. That turned into an argument as well. I'm also noticing her sister doesn't want to hang out with her, and they used to do things together all the time. But her sister's really just angry with her all the time, and she just wants to stay away. So we're thinking about natural consequences, and just based on this scenario, for this person thinking about what's happening as a result of her daughter's behavior, what could be some natural consequences this person can think about in this scenario? What are the natural consequences that might be happening? Okay, right, family relationships being affected. Her relationship with her sister is not going well. And with the parent. Or she's failing, right? Our grades are getting affected. Absolutely. She's not completing her assignments, or possibly would not be. Other natural consequences, getting removed from the team could be a natural consequence, right? She could possibly get tossed off. And the arguments are natural consequences. There's tension in the house. Absolutely, great job, everyone. And there are others here too, right? If we kept going, she had to sleep out in the chilly weather on the porch for a night, which could be another natural consequence. So you all identified consequences that this parent could think about. So here's just the critical discussion with this parent would be, what are the consequences she would be willing to allow happen? So if this parent thought like, well, maybe I should allow my daughter to experience some natural consequences. Could anyone identify a couple in situations that this behavior with this parent could allow happen? You identify that, the family relationships being affected, school grades. But what's the challenge for this parent? What were they doing before or in this scenario that might have made the natural consequences less effective? Okay, she's driving her to practice, right? Waking her up and driving her to practice. So that would be a blocking behavior, exactly. So if this mother thought maybe she would allow her daughter to experience the natural consequence of not making the practice, she may not necessarily want to drive her to practice or try to wake her up in the morning to get her there. Other natural consequences? Yep, staying on top of her, right? So maybe not staying up late every night trying to get her daughter to complete the assignments. Maybe for this parent, letting her daughter experience the consequences of not doing her assignments, so she stops staying up late trying to get on top of that. And it seems like this is more like the parent's agenda than the daughter's, which is hard for a parent, right? So here you're bringing up all the kind of really important conversations that the use of these strategies would entail. It's not easy allowing natural consequences. And no family member or family should be mandated to use them. It's really more about the discussion about this could be something that could help the daughter learn and link between her actions and the outcomes of her behaviors. And while it may be the agenda of the parent, what the parent would be doing strategically here is saying to the daughter, your behavior is what will be the thing that yields these outcomes. I'm going to just step back for a moment. Parent can still reinforce the behavior she wants to, but again, if she doesn't want her daughter failing and staying up late trying to get her daughter to complete assignments may not be the best strategy. Maybe stepping back and letting her daughter experience that grade could be a more important learning lesson for the daughter. And it's hard, and that's what brings us back to helping with awareness and parents' own coping strategies, and being able to think about these out loud with a family to think about how they would and what would be doable for them. Another one could be not going out to the porch and asking the daughter to come in. Maybe the daughter sleeping outside. Even if there was a blanket put on her, if a parent said, I'm willing to let her sleep outside and feel uncomfortable, but I don't want her to get sick, so putting a blanket could be a middle ground on that. Or maybe the parent, because of safety issues, just says that's not a strategy or a natural consequence I would allow to happen. But natural consequences and the use of them and thinking about their use is the part of craft that thinks strategically about how to respond to the weeds. What happens when a family is using positive reinforcement? They're thinking through the natural consequences they're willing to allow to happen. So for example, if the daughter was drinking and getting home late and missing soccer practice and the parent said, I'm not going to wake her up on time, maybe that's the consequence. But if those strategies and ideas are not working, what else does craft talk about in terms of responding in a way that helps reduce behaviors? And that brings us to this idea of limit setting, which is laying out beforehand and helping family members define their boundaries and limits, and thinking about how they can communicate that and how they would like to respond to behaviors that cross their boundaries or their limits. In craft, the use of limit setting strategies is a little in particular. It's mostly the removal of a reinforcer as a consequence to a behavior that crosses a boundary or a limit. So it can be a loss of privilege, or it can be a loss of access to a reinforcer, or it's withholding reinforcement in the moment. The reason why craft relies on that is the loss of a reinforcer is not a pleasurable thing to experience. It does make a link between the behavior and the loss of the reinforcer, which actually reduces behaviors. And it allows families to reintroduce the reinforcer when they see the behavior they would like to reinforce. So it can be used both ways, both as removing as a behavior reducing strategy, and can be reintroduced when a more preferred behavior is demonstrated. I'm just putting this slide up because the same principles apply to the removal of a reinforcer as they do to the delivery of a reinforcer. That when we think about behavior reducing strategy and setting limits, it's really helpful to help family members and loved ones think about the specific behaviors they would like to see decrease. So again, if we think about it in terms of I would like them to stop being irresponsible, that's a tough one. What does that mean? However, if it's defined as I would like to see the frequency of shouting decrease, that's a specific behavior. I would like to see a decrease in the days of drinking. I would like to see a decrease in the days of drug use. Things like that. Right? The more specific the behavior, the more useful it will be. Helping family members think if they do see the behavior they don't want to reinforce, how do they want to respond to that? And just as important, if they see the behavior they do want to see. So if there's a decrease in shouting and an increase or behavior in a civil tone, how do they want to reinforce that behavior? Notice both sides of the behavioral strategies are put into play here. Removing a reinforcer works best when it's after the behavior that occurs, not before. So we want to link it to a behavior. And removing reinforcers in a consistent, timely manner makes them a more powerful teaching moment. And again, how and what is removed needs to be doable for a family member. If their loved one drove home intoxicated and they wanted to take the car away, and at the same time their loved one has to get to work, and the only way they can get to work, giving everything, is to drive, removing the car might not be the best thing to take away, because gainful employment might be more important. Again, the messaging here is a thoughtful discussion and helping families think through about how they want to respond to behaviors, specific behaviors that cut across their boundaries. So let's just think about this and brainstorm. An individual talks about wanting to set limits because what's going on at home with their son, they're not really happy with, and they want to support their son, but they also have their own boundaries for some of this. So we hear that this individual's son lost his jobs and noticed his grades are getting worse. He's drinking a lot more, getting home late. He often has a buzz or is intoxicated when he gets home, and can be argumentative in that way. And they've also noticed that he's more cranky at home and avoidant of the parents. They're not talking much. He just shows up, asks for the car keys and for gas money. And when they ask him questions about what's going on, it just again turns into arguments and fights. And this person really wishes things were different. And they're really starting to feel put on because they're frustrated. They're paying for his cell phone, which he never really answers when they call. They're paying for his cable TV in his room. And the only time he seems to be in a good mood is when he's playing his guitar, and they're paying for his guitar lessons. So they really don't know what to do to influence or create a context of influence behavior. But they would like to see the getting home late decrease, and they would like to see the use of alcohol decrease. Those are two specific behaviors. So the first thing we just want to have them think about is if they were going to set limits, what could be some reinforcers that they could remove here? So anyone out there want to just take a stab at giving this scenario? What could be some reinforcers that they could remove in response to a behavior? There, okay, thank you. Stop giving him the car and money for gas. So access to the car could be a reinforcer that can be linked to increasing some behaviors or being removed in response to a behavior that crosses a boundary. Money for gas could be another thing as well. Absolutely. Anyone else? Okay. And also, I just saw that cell phone bill, right? So there's a cell phone bill, there's cable TV, and also maybe sit down and ask him what his goals are and lay down the rules. So this is really interesting. That could be a very collaborative approach and discussion to have. What would he like to see? What are his goals? And I'm just going to change the wording a little bit and lay down the rules, which we'll talk about. When we think about that from this perspective, is setting limits. And it's laying down, these are the behaviors that cross my limits and boundaries as a parent. And this is how I'm going to respond to those behaviors if they're to occur, which is, in a sense, putting rules out there. So thank you for all that. So we're going back to John, and he's going to lay down rules, or he would like to set limits with Jennifer. And she's back home. If we revisit this scenario, she's back home after graduating college. She's supposed to be looking for a job, and he's been worrying about her. She's not acting herself. And again, he's noticing that she's drinking several times per week and sleeping into the afternoon. And her mood's really kind of been irritable. And again, same situation. He's been putting in a lot of overtime at work. But he noticed Saturday night that when she came home with the car, she seemed to not be walking straight. He could smell alcohol on her breath. And he really believes she drove home intoxicated. And he wants to talk to her about that. And in the past, when he's tried to approach that, they argued, they shouted. And for him, that's a limit. Driving home intoxicated or having his child using the car under the influence is a limit for him. So he wants to be able to tell Jennifer, this is my limit, and this is how I'm going to respond if you cross that limit. So he's going to rely on his surf skills. Remember, the surf skills of specifying the behaviors he wants, using understanding statements, taking partial responsibility, and using labels for feeling statements. So he sits down with Jennifer, and after practicing with his counselor, scripting this out, this was the statement he would like to deliver with her, in a sense, laying down his own rules and boundaries. So he puts it out there that the other night, when it seemed like she had driven him home intoxicated, I felt really scared. So just notice as we go through here, can you identify the surf phrases? I know that it hasn't been easy for you since you came back from school, and I know I've been working a lot, so it may seem like I'm not available to help. But next time you've been drinking and you need to come home, can you please call me first? So here's a specific statement of what he would like to see happen, the flowers he would like to strengthen. I can help you figure out a safe way to get home. Here's the other part of the specific statement. If you do drive home intoxicated, you will lose the privilege of using the car for the weekend. So notice here what he's setting limits around is both trying to be specific in the behaviors he would like to see happen, as well as let Jennifer know driving home intoxicated is going to result in the loss of a reinforcer, which is the privilege of using the car for the weekend. Now, if Jennifer came home with a buzz on that Friday night, what does John have to do if his surfing and limit setting is going to be effective? And if we think about adding reinforcers, right, okay, making sure that he follows through and she loses privileges of the car. Absolutely. So in this case, that could be taking the keys away to restrict access. Now, if she came home intoxicated and drunk, maybe trying to get the keys away in that moment might not be the time. Perhaps waiting to the next morning to take the keys would be the way to go. So timing is important. But right, he would need to remove the reinforcer or access in order for his surfing and limit setting skills to be effective. Okay, and again, what we're using here are using language, using communication strategies to set up ways and highlight how he will be responding to behaviors that cross his limits. And of course, if she does call and ask to not drive and needs a lift home first, he would need to reinforce that, either by getting her a cab, by picking her up. He needs to sprinkle water on her calling him at night. If she were to call him intoxicated and he started yelling at her on the phone and calling her irresponsible, would that be reinforcing the behavior he would want to strengthen? Or in some sense, would that be punishing the behavior that he would want to strengthen? Anyone want to take a stab at that? right? Perhaps maybe if he yelled at her if she were to call, she may be less likely to want to call next time to get that ride home. So as you've all highlighted and people have stated, putting this into play takes thought and practice. And sometimes it's not always easy. It can be hard for parents, and we want to acknowledge that. These aren't magic bullets. They are effective responding strategies, though, that when paired with reinforcement and or watering the flowers you want to grow, can be particularly helpful as a combination in giving a compass to families about how they can respond to behaviors they want to respond positively to, and ways of thinking about how they can respond to behaviors they'd like to see decrease. Right? And again, we can see the use of surfing for limit setting with those same statements. The important part of practice I want to highlight here as well, these come in a history of interactions and arguments. So a beautiful gift people can have in working with friends or loved ones is to practice this beforehand, so that it can be delivered in a way where it might be more effective. And that kind of brings us to the last strategy we think about in responding to behaviors that we don't want to support. And that's just a strategy of stepping away. That often family members can get entangled. They can get entangled in conflict and get entangled in interactions that can escalate. And sometimes that can just make undesirable behaviors more likely to occur. So practicing stepping away is really just moving what we would call social reinforcement from the situation. And it also helps family members take a step back, breathe or pause, and think about how they want to respond. And the strategies and practice for that, it comes back to the importance of limit setting, helping families think out loud what behaviors are not acceptable for them, perhaps behaviors that are triggering for them that they notice they can get emotionally pulled into. Anticipate or look for signals if they're heading to those behaviors or those behaviors are more likely to occur. If someone comes home out late, 3 hours past their curfew, the time to have that conversation might be the next morning, because they know as they're sitting there during the night waiting for their loved one to get home, they can feel their emotional temperature going up, up, and up, and up, and know they're heading closer to a situation for emotional conflict. Or particularly if a loved one's belligerent or engaging in verbal interactions that can be really triggering because they're not talking nicely, they're cursing. All these things can be really tough to be in the face of. So practicing not taking the bait, realizing where they are, where their emotional temperature is, and being able to step back and making room to come back to what they value, how they want to be in the moment, and how can they stay true to their values and connections that keep them aligned with the kind of parent they want to be. And importantly, just being careful to take care of themselves, because sometimes stepping away from the situation, the mind can start chattering about you've lost, or you're giving up here, or you're not standing up to this person. There are all kinds of self-talk that can happen when stepping away. And the reframing here really is stepping away is a strategy. That is turning the water off. That is stepping away from the garden for a moment to catch one's breath, to recenter oneself, and to just think more strategically about how they want to respond to the situation, so that they're able to respond in a situation in a thoughtful way, and often a more effective way than when the emotional mind is jumping in there and chattering. So we did a whirlwind tour of the behavioral helping strategies found in CRAFT, which is the continued use of positive reinforcement that allows families to stay connected to their loved one, tend to the flowers they want to grow, And to also think strategically about how they want to respond to behaviors that they don't want to support. And that was really focusing on allowing for natural consequences and having discussions about that, defining their limits and thinking about how they can use the removal or access of reinforcers for behaviors that go across those limits, and being able to communicate that in a clear and concise way, both for inviting behaviors and also for setting limits. And then we just spent a brief time on the idea of stepping away as a strategy, which is not a sign of weakness or not a sign of losing. It's actually a sign of being able to step back, think more thoughtfully about responding, and responding from a place that's going to be more effective for families in the long haul. There are additional readings that you'll have access to with the links that have been sent out, I believe, over the last several weeks. And one is on the use of reinforcement, just in everyday interactions. And this was about how someone used it in their collaborative interactions with their husband, and others on the use of natural consequences and ideas about natural consequences in general. I really appreciate everyone attending. Some of these names I do recognize, and for people that have been there, we did over the last 6 weeks or last 6 discussions, talked about all these integrated parts of how to create a context for change, and not to control change, but by the use of understanding behavior through a different set of lenses, by keeping the the helper themselves as part of the helping process and in the context, and being aware of what challenges there are trying to create a context of change, and thinking strategically about use of communication strategies and behavioral support and reducing strategies. Together, this whole package does help shift and create a context that increases the likelihood that change can occur and be maintained over time. Obviously, it doesn't happen overnight for many people. The idea of practice is the connective tissue for all of this, and the ability to get feedback on how things are working and being able to adjust and think through and tailor it to meet the specific needs of loved ones and families who are looking to be there for them. You have all been invited to also think about your own role in walk in life. So I do want to leave you with the ideas in the work that you do, whatever hat you wear in your life, whatever the demands of your day are, however you give yourself to others, be it in a professional role, be it in both a professional and family role, that we can easily be focused on the parts of the garden that's not working. So to keep yourself as a gardener in the picture. Gardeners need nourishment too, if they're going to tend to a garden, and to broaden one's perspective. So what kindness can you show yourself today in the next 24 hours? And appreciate something in your day that's important to you that you can connect with. And also maybe perhaps to just put a little exclamation point on something you feel connected to and proud of today. Well, thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure to be able to serve this, and I hope this is useful in however you're thinking about using it in your journey in life.